Yeah, many of you all know Mairead as one of my GIS idols and matriarch to a generation of GIS professionals. Yeah, please welcome her to the stage.
No pressure.
We love you, Mairead.
Keep it coming. Kia ora. I am very, very pleased to be at the end of this journey. It's been about 3 years in the making, where I had some very interesting conversations with Ras Smith from Ngāti Kahungunu Wairarapa around what it means to weave connection to place, or to whenua, what it means to create connection with places that people are increasingly finding it difficult to be in, to visit, and understand what the experience actually is. So what I want to talk today, it's going to sort of range from the personal to the wetlandy and various sort of stages in between. I am not a VR coder. I am still not a VR coder. So this was sort of working with a number of different people to try and pull together something. My role in this was primarily as sort of a project manager type role, or producer, which is what I've put up on the VR app itself. But what we've done, or what we set out to do, was, with the help of Vision Mataranga funding from MB, was to create a digital wetlands platform called Wairarapa Glistening Water. And we went and visited a number of different wetlands, chosen by Kahungunu, to tell stories of place. But the platform itself has 4 main elements. So the idea that we have an associated website, we have a YouTube channel, we've got the VR app, which I'm going to focus on mostly today, but also the digital resources underpinning these all are also an integral part of that platform. So to see, one of the problems we have with sort of the VR kit that we end up using is that things change. So since the start of this project, and where we are now, this is a Quest 2 headset. Quest 1 came out, Quest 2 came out, and now there's a new version. So the VR controllers, or the VR consoles, change really quickly. So it's to make sure those digital resources are there underpinning and can be reused. But we focused on wetlands for one main reason. In the Wairarapa, the pre-human wetlands, I'm going to have to hop it over on the other screen somehow. Here we go. The pre-human wetlands are significantly different to where we are at the moment. We've got sort of, the current wetlands are about 90% reduced from where they were in pre-human times. Oh, pop, right. Come on. Can move on. There we go. So we've got wetland loss that's estimated around 90% across New Zealand. Now that has a significant impact for biodiversity, for carbon and nitrogen runoff, for a whole host of different features, and sort of the water table, and our uses of landscape, and also what we see in our landscape. So it was just sort of to privilege this type of landscape that a lot of people had dismissed as being a nasty bog, rather than actually something that's an integral part of our ecosystem, but provides some really key ecosystem services. Also underlying this was the idea, as I mentioned, of digital tonga, that we have reuse and reuse of digital features, but also fitting with the kaupapa Māori. And that was very much led by the iwi, but understanding what their needs and values actually were. Now that was massively impacted by COVID, because all of the huis we'd planned didn't happen, and nobody wanted to use Zoom, and wouldn't it be great if we could just wait another few months? So this sort of became a bit more of a hodgepodge. But at the core of this is also sort of an understanding of data sovereignty, and the information that we create, how important that is for Ngāti Kahungunu, rather than just sort of as data itself. So we went out into the field, and we were initially collected data at 5 different sites. At one point, I drove the university van up a very steep, rather slippy slope, and had to reverse it back down in a corner. So there was some fun field work. I'm not telling our health and safety officer that, strangely enough. But we went out, we used this, this really neat little camera. It's a 360-degree camera that the film school very kindly lent to us, probably because they didn't know where I was bringing it. And we stood in the middle of wet fields. One of the things we looked at the time was how do we capture the data in these locations to make it feel as much like you're there as possible. And one of the things we were thinking about, well, wetlands, it rains a lot. Maybe we could put like a see-through umbrella on top. Turns out the film school weren't so keen on that idea. Who knew? So we also made use of the VAW recording studios and had a number of narratives written by Ra Smith, who's reflected in the glass, and Marama Fox was one of the narrators who came in and recorded those audios in an environment. And we ended up with some very detailed video in 8K, which we've downgraded to 4K for available online.
Fitia etera Maya akenga poraruraru Makere anna ngahere erere Wairua erere ki ngā ao o te rangi Whiti whitia e te rā Mahea akenga o raruraru Makere anna ngahere Makere anna ngahere Scattered by the wind, washed by the rain. And
now, unfortunately, I don't have time to show you the sort of 12 minutes of each location. Feel free to go to the YouTube site to see them. They're all 360-degree videos, so you can actually move around them. We've also recorded them in 2 different seasons, so both in winter and in spring, because one of the things about wetlands is how changeable they are in different seasons. And each of those locations had a narrative written by Ra for those locations to tell of the whakapapa and the history and sort of the naming of these places, to build a bit of a deeper connection rather than just simply experiencing them. We've also recorded an ambisonic 360-degree sound, and that's available as well. I'm hoping I can figure out how to actually move forward on this without clicking it. No, this is not working. Oh, here we go. No. And this is the app. So I'm not going to let it run completely, but we've started with a splash screen. The main reason that splash screen is there is because we're doing a lot of outreach events, and we wanted people to start from a specific location. From there, you kind of enter this very abstract landscape with the Wairarapa gateway. And you're given, sorry, I probably should stand closer to the mic, and you're given information about how to navigate. Now, I'm going to skip that because I couldn't sit there last night and listen to it. And then you enter into the Wairarapa landscape, having gone through that. And those 5 different wetlands are present as 5 different sort of globes that you can then fly into with their names above them. Now, what's happening here is you can see that the quality of the aerial imagery isn't so great, especially in comparison to the YouTube videos. Which is a huge source of frustration for me. But again,
into the world of light and life.
That's one of the limitations of the headsets. They are essentially a good mobile phone. And then we end up in the locations where we can change seasons. I'm just going to hopefully, does Ra start talking yet? Yeah, and I'm going to switch back a bit too quick. So this is what this looked like initially, right? So this isn't computer generated. Well, it is technically computer generated, but this is real data with a proper sort of computer generated sky above it. And this is what we hoped that our app would look like, and actually set out to develop it like that.
To our esteemed visitors from the fall,
We used
welcome
a
to
HTC Vive,
come and listen to the
and
stories
I
about
got
wetlands,
myself a nice, sweet
stories
gaming
about
computer with a
and
really
the
lovely
stories
graphics
about
card.
gods.
And I found out fairly quickly, I'm
I'm
just going to pause the audio. I found out fairly quickly that that does not translate to these headsets. So some of the issues we have then is actually in terms of moving from geographic information to a VR environment, you have to start thinking about things like weather. And initially we put it as the night sky. It was black, it was just easier. But what happened then was we then also had to limit the scale or the extent of the area we're actually interested in. So we essentially had what would look like a tabletop, which none of my computer programmers were bothered about. They were fine with that. And I'm like, but it's supposed to look like a landscape. They were fine with this sort of floating area in the middle of nowhere with no geographic context, which is continually an issue sometimes when you're talking to people outside of geographic discipline or a geographic or spatial understanding, that they're not really seeing the importance of doing something spatial in space with some spatial context. Some of the other stuff is lighting. So at what stage do you light it from? Because one of the things we'd realized as well is that one of the computer programmers actually put the sun in the sky in the wrong place. Because again, the data isn't something that's important to him. Or isn't something that he's necessarily familiar with using. And if you think of some really high fidelity gamings like Red Dead Redemption, when you're looking at these fantastic landscapes, one of the things that's happening is they are making a lot of little sneaky sort of meanders through that landscape, so that they're reducing your field of vision. If the computer processing is taking too long, they'll chuck in a clump of trees or a mountain or a building that will stop your field of vision from taking too long to process. We can't do that. I tried. So we're limited in sort of trying to base it in the real world. And in one sense, that's significantly more problematic than it is in the computer gaming world. Because, you know, they can be like, oh, this isn't running quickly enough. Let's just like replicate the blade of grass to look like a different blade of grass, even though we used it over there. Whereas if we're sort of putting trees in the landscape, people will see fairly quickly that they're the same 5 trees. So it's how do you actually do that in a way that's meaningful and draw on the digital assets. Plus, as I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, the idea that New Zealand trees are a little bit different and therefore require training on New Zealand data sets. Equally, there are very few virtual assets actually available to work in New Zealand at this stage that replicate the flora and fauna in New Zealand. And we've got some of the issues around that are about data sovereignty as well. So if, say, for example, you've got a VR firm that develops those assets for an iwi or for an organization, who owns them? So if you've like created a pushkawa tree, for example, like who owns that asset and who can reuse it afterwards? Especially if there's some sort of idea of tongue or association, particular cultural association with that asset you've created. And some of the stuff is fairly normal in terms of vertical exaggeration. What exaggeration do you put on this because you're dealing with a 3D scene versus 2D? So there's a slight difference between moving from 2D to 3D, which, you know, you start taking into account virtual exaggeration, but then also moving from 3D into some sort of temporal, more immersive environment where you start bringing weather and lighting, not lightning, and then also start thinking a little bit about storage and the compromises that are around that. And because the focus of the app was about experiencing these wetland locations, we limited based on the map, that really hurt, versus the videos, because it was about, the map provided context rather than it was the primary reason for the app itself. And this is just the different headset. So this is because I promised this had to have some ArcGIS in it. This is my map. It's we started off with these 5 different locations over in the Wairarapa. And we needed a 50K grid. Well, we didn't need a 50K grid, but a 50K grid basically allowed us to enclose these areas, plus have them bounded in two senses by mountains, which would give us sort of a natural cutoff for the sort of field of vision. You know, you've got you've got the sea to the bottom, you've got mountains to either side, and then you've got sort of Maastricht to the north, which we'll just ignore, right? But so the first problem we encountered was, how do you get that data, which is in New Zealand NZTM, into something that actually is a perfect square in terms of the number of rasters in each direction. So the number of cells need to be exact in each direction. So we reoriented the map. So one of the things I thought I'd be able to do, which is really very, very unfortunate, is just draw a 50 grid square like this, and just like pull out the DEM and recalibrate it to sort of face the direction I wanted it to do. That doesn't work. Because when you change that grid swell, because it has to actually be a perfect square as you're in the VR app in order to reduce the amount of load time. So it can't actually be at an angle. If you reorient that square, you end up getting something that isn't 50 km by 50 km by 50 km. It's slightly off, at which point then it won't actually allow you to recalibrate your raster grid. So we converted everything into Hoteen projection, because the other option was literally creating our own projection system. But I found one where New Zealand looks incredibly skewed and used that instead. Which really goes against every cartographic principle I've ever operated by. I went through all the different world projections to try and find something that oriented New Zealand in the way that I needed it to, rather than made any sense for data outside of this project. And that's what we pulled out, and we got our perfect count in terms of each of those grid cells actually meaning something, because that significantly improves the load time within VR. So what were we trying to do? We were trying to create a greater connectedness with Wairarapa Moana. We wanted to weave the identity to reconnect people with these places. But underneath it all is Kahungunu have just gone through the Treaty Settlement Trust as a treaty settlement process, and they now have some financial backing to be able to do conservation and land management decision making in a way that's actually meaningful in the region. But also I was personally interested in a better understanding of the cultural elements of the different landscapes to be able to figure out ecosystem service mapping. So what we've done in the interim is brought this on the road. I ran 4 days over in the Wairarapa. I ran Wings over Wairarapa, which was an absolute disaster because it got rained out one of the days. And we also ran it at Earthfest in Lower Hutt as well. And I just want to talk a little bit about that experience, because a lot of people when I'm talking about VR go, oh, that's amazing. Like, this is going to be such a great outreach tool. It's going to be a way of like reaching people and getting them to engage with geographic information in a way. There was a huge reticence about adults putting on the headsets. They hated it. They were so happy to shove their kids into that so quick. So like a parent would come up and they'd be like, oh, you know, little Johnny would love to do this. And little Johnny's sitting there and I have a spare seat, you know, with everything set up. And I was like, would you like to try it yourself? Oh, no, I'm okay. And then would proceed to tell me how different their world is to theirs. Like, you know, it's sort of, oh, the world is so different for them. No, you're just not doing it. And it's this huge sort of understanding that putting on a headset can mean, and I'm going to deliberately do it in a large room of people who then I won't be able to see, is incredibly isolating. So while you can all still see me, I'm seeing nothing right now. And it's really uncomfortable. There has to be something to do with how that immersive environment is essentially a very individual feeling. You're really cut off. And some of the parents got a little bit awkward about the fact that kids were seeing stuff. And in one case, this child freaked out completely and were like, oh my God, like just octaves went up. And it was because she was flying over the ocean, because there's nothing in this app that's like that reaction. Well, I'd like there to be, but really there isn't. But she was flying over Onucky's Spit and just was like, my feet are over the ocean. And she thought it was great, but like, you know, her parents started getting really worried. But they couldn't see what she could see. So it's this very sort of individual experience that isn't necessarily translating across. And that's sort of the interesting thing about outreach. I recently had some chats with some guys down at NIWA who were sort of thinking about VR, and I was like, get a touch table instead. Because what you want is people to actually talk with each other and discuss what it is that you're seeing in terms of making these sort of understanding of landscapes and shared understanding. That's me telling myself to shut up. Shared understanding of landscapes, rather than this very individual experience. Now, it works in terms of weaving that connection, but it can, overcoming that reticence to put something on your head and feel vulnerable in a public space like the local library can be really difficult. Right, I'm going to skip. One of the things we've also got on the website is georeferenced historic maps. This is an image from a former PhD student who just finished up and is about to graduate in this building next month, but about looking at that landscape and sort of looking at it more deeply and what that can actually mean. And one of the things he found within that space is that people like describing what they were seeing. So even though they were inside the headset, you know, the sort of the communication aspect is one of the things that at the moment VR isn't working so well on. Right, I'm going to leave it with that. Spatial is special sometimes, which is the whole 50 km thing rotated, not quite staying 50 km. Seriously, that took like 2 weeks of my life. And then how is this really a step in for an experience of real space? And I'm hoping with the sort of, as these things develop, they have more storage, and you can actually get a more immersive environment without actually doing something particularly crazy, like, for example, this Nova Ball, which is the next project we're working on. So this is 360 degree. I think we haven't been able to play with it yet because it's health and safety nightmare, and the university won't let us yet. But I think it's a little bit like a Zorb. But we're looking at experiencing place in 3D in these sort of very incredibly immersive environment with a high quality and seeing what actually that means and what that does. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mairead. Yeah, very cool stuff, and thanks for breaking down some of those challenges. Yeah, if you want to ask any questions, please find Mairead at the afternoon tea break or after.